I'll move to it. I really appreciate getting the opportunity to do this. The history of the decisions this board has made and the different people that have been on the board over the years is worth looking at. It's an interesting story, one that is often quoted incorrectly. But I thought the way I've set it up is I've got several kind of landing strips in here, things that I hope that we could agree on so that we get to a point where we don't agree. I won't have to go all the way back to the beginning. I just go back to the last place where we agreed. So that's the architecture that I've used to set this up. This is starting off in 2014, which is really when we had enough of the advanced metering in place that we could actually gather data and start to learn what the data was telling us. And so in 2014, the first truth that I hope we could agree on is that the electric plant board buys at wholesale rates, buys electricity at wholesale rates, and sells at marked up retail rates in order to gather revenue to cover our fixed costs and the wholesale power bill from TVA. I mean, it's really just three things we're trying to cover, two things: the wholesale costs from TVA and our fixed costs. We also hope can agree that the EPB grid has value. And when I say grid, I found one, somebody asked about a good graphic to demonstrate what the grid is. And this is a pretty good one. In this one, the dividing line here would represent the boundary between TVA and Glasgow Electric Plant Board. So when I say grid, I'm talking about this part, where we buy power from TVA and then we do all the things that we do to distribute that to our customers in Glasgow. And that it does have value, we think, I hope we can agree on that, and that the grid ought to be maintained in a way that meets the demands of the people of Glasgow. So can we agree on those points to get rolling?
How much value is that grid? I mean, is it what in the millions? I mean, what is, you talking about your trucks? Everything?
Yeah, everything. Everything that doesn't vary or doesn't belong to TVA, and the things that we provide in order to serve our customers is what I call the grid. Everything: people, buildings, trucks, tools, debt service,
substations.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Y'all ready to move on from that? Okay. So, as you all know from in normal board meetings that we really haven't had one since the two new people have been on the board, but we normally have a number of metrics that we talk about to give everybody a snapshot of how we're operating. And this is one of the ones in 2014 that was a fairly common metric for me to use. And it's just one that really only measures two things. The blue bars measure how many units that we sold each year of kilowatt hours. If I were a grocery store, this might be measuring the number of bags of potato chips I sold or what have you. But so you can see that over the years, when we were in 2014, looking back, with respect to just the number of kilowatt hours that we were selling, there's a pretty identifiable trend there. It's going down. Of course, it really started in the Great Recession in 2008, and then it followed on in Glasgow, with the closing of industries, large and small. SKF bit the dust back in that era. And the ones that remained began to use less energy, and even, as it turns out, all customers, even residential customers, began to use less energy, so we sold fewer units. The only other measurement on this graphic is this gray line, and that represents our fixed costs. Those things that we just talked about, the grid, our debt service, all the things that it takes to deliver these units to the end customer. And that refers to this axis over here, and you can see that it, for years, has hung around $4.2 million a year, something like that. So one of the things that in 2014, and the members of this board then were Norma Redford and Jeff Harnett and M.D. Armstrong, Jim Lee, Cheryl Berry Ombach. When they looked at this and thought about the fact that we're using volumetric rates, and that's something you're gonna hear me say a lot. When I say volumetric rate, I mean that we're selling these units and in a way that we measure the volume that people are using, and we hope that the volume that people use, after they're marked up a little bit, that markup is enough to hit this line up here, the fixed costs. So those folks told me that, wow, this looks like a trend. It looks like it could be real trouble, and since you now have the ability to dig into the data that these meters are producing, why don't you begin to tell us what kind of trouble that we're in? You know, where are we losing these sales, and which of those sales are the most damaging to the utility for you to lose? So I snapped a salute, and my team started putting together a deep dive into the data underlying this trend.
Well, excuse me, sir, what are the two peaks on the fixed costs there? You see two peaks?
Well, I mean, you
Quite
know,
above.
yeah, I mean, every year we have different things that, I don't know, big storms or what, I mean, it's not dead flat, but it is relatively flat. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, I'm just saying, why are your fixed costs going up, essentially?
Well, they vary. I mean, you know, some years you have more retirements and you hire more people, you know, and some years you do.
With the what do you mean retirements? Because you were talking about perhaps doing a sunset clause on the fixed rate. We have the alternate fixed rate you have now. Was that mentioned before about sunset clausing that alternate rate out?
I didn't follow.
Because of retirements and stuff coming up. Well, if they're KRS employees, what's the retirement cost to you?
I'm not talking about the retirement costs. I'm talking about the fact that as people retire and some years you have more than one person in because you've got a trainee in, or you've got a new group of apprentice linemen in. I mean, it's not going to be dead flat. You know, it's varying. This shows it varying from 4.2 million to 4.5 in a $40 million a year business. So it's really not a material. I mean, I wouldn't consider it material.
That's what I'm trying to get at. What justifies what is it, the peak demand rate of 11 some odd dollars and then what is it?
Okay, I've got some
That
great
comes from
slides.
TVA, though.
I've got some great
That
slides.
comes from TVA.
This has nothing to do with energy
All right,
here.
how long is our TVA contract for?
Well, it's
Guys,
forever.
you're getting way off the topic.
I'll be glad to answer this stuff, but it's not.
TVA is an
proceed.
Are you
ongoing
gonna answer
contract
it in your
forever?
presentation?
Well, this is the kind of discussion I meant we need to have.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah.
What, sir?
Is that a
Termination notice is 5 years.
suspend the rules thing?
Yeah, it's an
We can
evergreen
terminate
contract.
it. It's
It has a
evergreen.
5-year clause.
That we can terminate it, but it will terminate 5 years from then. We did that once.
But understand, Mark, that this is fixed costs. It doesn't have anything to do with energy.
So that's the
That's
cost of
operating.
operating.
That's the cost of
I know
operating
that.
this
Operating
utility.
plan.
Has
Operating
nothing to do with
cost.
the peak. That's
I'm
two
saying,
totally
why
separate.
is there an $11 peak demand to
I've got
help
a-
you with your fixed costs?
I've got a great slide to show you.
I'd like to see it.
Okay. Okay. So when we first started, in 2014, when the board wanted to start looking at these mechanics, one of the first things we always had to talk about is the bill that we get from TVA every month. And this is just an example of one we got in July of 2016, but they all look about the same. And the top number on there is the demand charge. This is what TVA charges us for the peak hour. So the answer to your question, why is there an $11 charge? Because that's what TVA charges us. And then the next
TVA
thing.
then. Dump TVA. Why,
Well,
does KU, anything like that? Any of them other?
we tried
Shortening?
it.
Every utility.
We have tried it.
I'm not familiar with every utility on planet Earth. I'm gonna try not
I'm
to
talking about the
say.
Glasgow, the region.
All regional utilities that I'm aware of, TVA, the Southern Company, East Kentucky Power, KU, they all structure their wholesale bill this way, and I'll show you in a minute. If you'll give me a chance to go through the story, I think a lot of these questions will be answered. But the three main things that we worry about trying to collect enough revenue to cover, two of them are the payment we have to make to TVA every month, and it includes a demand charge. We didn't invent that, they did. And there's probably a good reason for it. And then we buy about $1.5 million worth of energy in kilowatt hours from TVA every month. So an average bill for us is about $2 million. And then the other thing is covering the fixed costs that we talked about. Now, here's where some of the peak demand stuff comes from. I call this slide a year in the life of the grid. And there's a line on there. There's 365 lines on there, 24 hours across this axis. And over here on this axis is the KW demand for the city of Glasgow. The 12 brightly colored lines are the peak day of the 12 months of the year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how TVA generates the power to cover our needs. Please come back down.
It's a closet door.
Okay. So the first thing TVA does is they try to run what they call base load plants all the time. And those would generally be something fairly inexpensive to run, like nuclear that likes to run all the time. And you can see that since we use power in this kind of a sine wave fashion, but generating plants output power in more of a rectangle, they're not able to modulate up and down, so they have to run a lot of different facilities to cover the demand. And in this example, I'm looking at this highest line, this dark blue line. So they start off with a couple of plants that are pretty easy to price. And this is kind of a calculus issue here. So the area under these curves is energy, the kilowatt hours. And the top is the peak demand. So it's fairly easy for TVA to price these plants that run all the time because it has a predictable, you can calculate the area of that rectangle. You know how many kilowatt hours are in it. You take the running cost for that plant and divide it by the kilowatt hours, and it comes out, in a reasonable fashion. But then the trouble starts. Because of the bizarre shape of the load, they have to start running different kinds of plants. And these would probably be hydro. Hydro's great, it's inexpensive, it can be started at the drop of a hat, it can be turned back off. You'd think we just use that all the time, but lakes have a finite volume, and you can't run it all the time, so they're very careful to try to use it when they really need it, when there's these large inflections in the shape of the demand, and then they'll stop using that before they deplete the resource. So they'll start kicking in some maybe natural gas. Then, 11 o'clock or so, that's when they start firing up the coal plants. This is for a hot summer day. So then coal comes on. It's a lot more expensive, and it doesn't get to run all day long, so it can't be called base load.
What does it cost to start a coal plant?
I have been told by TVA that it's about $1 million.
Just to start it?
Yeah, because what they do after they stop it, when the load goes down around midnight, the only way to get it started again is to fill it full of crude oil and set that on fire, and then wait for it to get hot enough for them to start pouring the coal.
TVA's moving away from coal big time. They're doing methane.
You mean, you talking about?
I mean, there's
you're talking about
68% methane.
Natural gas, yeah.
Yeah, natural gas.
Yeah. There's a lot of natural gas in TVA's portfolio. As the stack goes up, they start using more of that. As they run out of that, they go to the next expensive resource, and that'd be buying power from a neighbor. And then they got some combustion turbines that run on different fuel sources. Those are right up there at the top. Now, what do you notice about the difference between a baseload plant and a plant higher up the stack? Doesn't run as many hours, and it's very unpredictable. So setting a rate just in kilowatt hours to cover all these different varieties of resources that might be used on any given day is impossible. And the only alternative would be for the rates to vary wildly every day, just depending on what TVA is running. So what they do is choose a kilowatt hour rate that kind of averages these costs, and they add a demand charge for the peak hour every month to try to get the revenue they need to amortize these resources that you couldn't pay for just by the energy they generate because they're not running long enough. So they're kind of like fixed costs too, and TVA collects some of their fixed costs through the demand charge.
So what you're saying is they've got a power plant up here that may cost several $1 million, and it sits there idle for hours upon end until it's actually needed. Then it's turned on for an hour at a time, or 2, or 3, but the rest of the time it's idle. So to recoup the cost of that idle plant that's there just when we need it, there has to be an extra charge for that particular 2 or 3 hours.
Sure, they have to amortize it, they borrow money just like we do, and if it's not running enough to generate enough kilowatt hours, but still is necessary on days that the load is too high for these base load plants to carry, yeah, and they could have done it, and TVA is moving in the direction of doing more like what we ultimately decided to do. That fixed costs like that should be paid for, but with fixed charges, and TVA is going in that direction. But now, and remember, still talking about 2014, it was just pure area under the curve. We'll charge you so much per kilowatt hour. The peak, the apex, will charge you so much per kW. And that's the way the business works. And it's not exclusive to TVA. It's extremely common throughout this industry.
Do other companies call one peak? I mean, you're calling 4 peak days to make sure you hit the peak day. Could that be brought down some, to 3 days or something? Y'all are kicking and screaming.
Y'all are on the board now. You can decide
Attorney General.
all that stuff.
You wanted 6 or 5, wasn't it? When the advisory board. met?
I really can't flow, if you'll let me flow through this, I'll address that in a minute.
We don't set the peak, the customers as a whole set the peak.
No,
It's just
Industry mainly sets the peak.
I've got slides.
Everybody has their pro rata share. Industry has a contribution, but so does all residential. If we had not one industrial operation in this town, we'd still have a peak. We would still get a bill from TVA. There's no such thing as one person or this person sets the peak. That's just not the case.
So why aren't peaks on weekends then, when people are home cooking and stuff like that?
There's load on the weekend, but that's not when we reach the TVA peak.
The load does what it does, Mark. I mean, that's just we don't control it, the people control that. Anyway, that was an explanation of why there's a peak demand charge, and this is just some representative pictures of what the grid is, what our fixed costs are, all the technology that's out there, all the equipment that it takes to make the technology work. So, the old rates, and this is the way almost all utilities design their rates, and this is the way our rates were in 2014. And as the board asked me to explain more about how they work and what sort of trouble we were looking at with a declining volume of sales, I started off, and Jeff is the only one that's been on the board the whole time. He's seen this slide a million times, but classic rate design is done this way. You look at the costs that are involved in serving a customer, and this is residential. It's more complicated for non-residential, but for a residential customer, the first thing a consultant does or the utility does is estimate these 4 different costs that they believe the average customer is going to put on the system. And then they used to, and our old rates were like this, you took those 4 estimates, you wrapped them all together and tried to turn it into a super simple rate. And you'll notice that when we did, even in 2014, there was a coincident demand charge in the rates. It just wasn't exposed. It was just part of this component and that component and that component and that component added together and priced at the target of what we thought the average consumption was going to be, how much coincident demand the average customer is going to contribute, how much off-peak energy they're going to buy, how much on-peak, and what our fixed costs were. So the old rates looked like this. It was like 10 cents a kilowatt hour, plus a little, if you're a golfer, I kind of call this a mulligan. There was a little customer charge that just recognized that we already had to make 4 guesses we're probably gonna be wrong. So we throw a little customer charge in there just to try to make up for the mistakes that were probably made. And that's just because humans didn't have good data until the advent of modern metering that gives you good data. So we were having to base all this on what the industry considered to be good, solid guesses. Turned out though, after the board had told me to start researching what really happens out there, and once we had the data coming in from the meters, we found out pretty much everything in there was guessed incorrectly. That our fixed costs were higher than we guessed, that people use less energy on peak than we thought, more off peak than we thought, and their contribution to coincident demand was much higher than we thought it was. So, we began to move forward. And here's another landing spot. I'm going to start presenting you with a lot of the data we found, and if we're going to get to a point where that you just don't believe the data, then we can't get anywhere. So, and let me just say this, that the data for 8,000 customers collected every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year produces terabytes of data. And to go in and try to spin it in some particular way would take a level of sophistication that is beyond what my team has. So I hope that we can just agree that the results of the data dive are good. They're not spun some kind of way.
You contracted some computer companies to try and install software and stuff for you. I saw those in some of the old minutes and stuff. Didn't you get some companies to help you crunch that data and stuff?
Yeah, well, not really crunching the data. The brilliant people that I've got on the team crunch the data, but we had to constantly have to buy software to help accumulate the data from the meters, and then we buy different kinds of operating systems to use it, but the core mathematics was done by me and my team. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that by 2015, the board was able to see some of the results of this data. It's pretty straightforward. For the average residential customer, which the way we got the average was you took a whole year, fiscal year 2015, a year of all the residential customers together, divided by the number of residential customers, and we came up with the average customer in 2015 used 988 kilowatt hours a month. We were charging, from those 4 blocks, the way we used to design it, we thought that the rate should be 9.8 cents a kilowatt hour. We were charging an $11 customer charge. So the average bill in 2015 that was printed out and went to the customer was for $107.82. Now, once you that's the way we used to do it when you just had walk-in meter readers and you just walked around to see how many kilowatt hours that meter used during the month. You could produce that kind of bill. With more sophisticated meters, we were able to line this bill up with what the actual wholesale cost. Remember, you saw the wholesale power bill from TVA. It had a charge for peak demand, it had a charge for on-peak kilowatt hours and off-peak kilowatt hours. So we found that 988 was made up of 245 on-peak kilowatt hours that we have to pay TVA 7.5 cents for, and 742 kilowatt hours off-peak that we have to pay TVA 6.4 cents for. And we found that the average customer was contributing 2.22 kW to the peak. The TVA was charging 10.13 for. So you add all that up, and the $41 fixed charge for a residential meter determined by TVA, our regulator, using our data. And you add all that stuff up and you came up with $129 of expense for this person that got a bill of $107.82. So the average customer, and Jeff has seen this before, but the average customer, we were losing $21 on, $22. Now, the next mathematical step would be, well, okay, then how much more do we need people to use to break even? And so that's just a little algebra problem. You solve for 0, and it turns out to be 1,210 kilowatt hours. So at 9.8 cents, the residential customer need to use 1,210 kilowatt hours, or about 25% more than they were using, to break even. Now, remember that chart I showed you on sales decline? Is there any chance that residential customers are going to start using 25% more kilowatt hours? No. So, the board gave me my next marching orders. And this is more sophisticated than what the boards back in those days got to see, because we didn't have this kind of graphics available. But the question we were trying to answer in those days was, okay, how many people are average customers using that 1,210 kilowatt hours a month? How many are using less than that, and how many are using more than that? In Jeff's day, back in 2014 and 15, we did that with 8,000 line spreadsheets, trying to, synthesize all the addresses out of there and make decisions. Now we can do it a lot easier. Sorry, Jeff, but this is what's available now. This is just an overlay of all the customers' average bills for a year, plotted on a real map of Glasgow. And you can see pretty quickly that how many yellow dots do you see? Yellow is the people that use 1,210 kilowatt hours a month. And that's kind of the disturbing thing about using, batting the word average around, is that almost nobody is average. You don't see many yellow dots on there. The predominant color you see is green. People that were using less than 1,210 kilowatt hours a month, therefore we were serving them at a loss. But also you'll notice there's no systematic representation of that. Every place you find green dots, you also find red dots. Now those are people that are using over 1,210 kilowatt hours a month. So the nature of volumetric rates, if you've got a fixed addition to every kilowatt hour, and that's targeted to break even at a certain level of kilowatt hours, if you use more, we're over collecting from you. You're paying too much. And that's just the nature of a volumetric rate, and that's why they're problematic. I can zoom around here. I've got control of this, so anybody who has a certain neighborhood they want to look at, but the one thing you'll notice is that there's not really any rhyme or reason, and a lot of the stories that you hear about, these low usage customers are also low income customers and they're being put upon. Well, in some cases that's true, but for the most part, when those boards, like you guys, looked at this in 2014 and 15, they saw this diversity where that you could not make simplistic conclusions about who's getting a good deal and who's getting a bad deal. The only thing that's simplistic is that volumetric rates, because of the wide variety and the way people use energy, and probably in our community the biggest diversity factor is you got an all-electric home or a gas-heated home. I think I could say with a high level of confidence that most of those green dots are probably gas-heated homes. And the reason that the boards determined that looked kind of unfair was that the fixed costs of serving a green dot and a red dot are the same. The only thing difference between the dots is how much energy they used, and energy is a separate account over here that we're not really talking about. I'm just talking about how do you collect the money to pay the fixed costs of serving a customer. So that board, those boards, there was more than one. By 2015, by the time I got the marching orders to design a rate, I guess the board was Norma Redford and Jeff and Carolee Oldenkamp, Cheryl Berry, and Jim Lee. And they looked at that and said, well, we've reached a fork in the road. We either choose to ignore this and hope that the red dots never find out that they are overpaying so that the green dots can underpay. That was an option. I just worked for them. That was an option that they could have taken. There's plenty of utilities seemingly taking that option. But they chose the other option, which was, can't we bring fairness to this? Is there not a way to make everybody pay as close to the exact cost as possible? And my response was, I don't know. Let's see what we can come up with.
That was before the SET project. Those
Oh,
numbers
yeah.
were before SET.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
57% of people rent, households rent, and they can't do a lot about what that envelope around the house should talk about, and the batteries, they can't do anything about that. So they are stuck, and it's not their fault. And it's not just, a few score of people, it's a crap load of people. That's my
I
big
think
deal.
I couldn't argue with that. But also, a lot of those red dots, Mark, are rental properties. And the reason they're red often is that property is kind of substandard. And that may often be occupied by a low-income person. So,
More likely to be.
the old rates that so often people yearn for were, I just demonstrated, patently unfair and fell heavily on a lot of low-income people that were having to overpay in order to support the green dots. And a lot of the green dots represent people that I would guess are pretty well financially fixed. So that just added to those boards' conviction that we need to tell you and your team to propose a way to fix this problem.
Well, let me interrupt.
If you've got those addresses, were the red dots the ones that got the SET stuff? Or you get the 331 houses?
Well, that money was targeted only for all-electric homes, so I would say the preponderance of.
But you had to alter it, though. I mean, I've got, you altered it to, you had some 50 ultra houses where you did everything.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
then you
that
took
was-
some gas houses because there wasn't enough people signing up for it. Didn't you send it out for people to sign up for and everything?
We begged people to sign up for it, but they had to have all-electric homes. I mean,
Well,
there
you-
may have been.
You did some gas, you did some gas.
Okay, well,
We didn't.
Wouldn't do mine,
Gas did
wouldn't do
not
mine, and
go-
I tried,
Gas
because
did
I got
not-
gas.
Batteries,
I do too.
the batteries did not go in gas homes, is what I
and the water
recall.
heaters didn't go in gas homes. I don't know what might have happened in gas homes, but I wouldn't argue the
They were
point.
on gas.
You had to
But,
do
but
something.
Mark,
116 or
what the
something.
other thing was kind of interesting is some of these places, these households that have families and several children, those are some of your higher users.
I know.
And those are the individuals that trying to collect fixed cost through a markup was actually hurting people you think at first that you were helping, but that was actually not the case. That was one of the most revealing discoveries, is that
I just wish you'd done-
families were getting hurt by trying to collect your cost volumetrically. And I think we'll get to that,
But
but
some of those families also are hurt because you'd be, I'm in the education business, and that you'd be surprised at the numbers of kids that are being raised by grandparents. And when those kids bring in Wii's and cell phones and stuff, I mean, they feel helpless, and they're just really, it's not good.
I don't disagree with you. I think we've got a problem, but I don't think that it's solely an electric rate.
No, I mean, if we're gonna start, we need to be up front of, picketing grocery stores and health insurance companies and
Well-
drug companies, and, their costs don't go down, they go up substantially every year.
I brought this, let me.
The problem is you've got to choose between price
Copy this.
and reliability.
Or give it
And
to
let me
them.
tell you, you want pitchforks and torches at your front door, tell them you're gonna shut their bid down for 2
Mark,
hours.
I went to the last
What I brought, it was buried in the Moody's report, but it was kind of just jaw-dropping to me. There's a report a year ago about Glasgow being the poorest community, and I think we've had a tendency to shrug that off. But according to most recent U.S. Census data, Glasgow's median family income is 47.9% of the U.S. median, and which is down from 68%, 68.3% in 2014. So I agree with everything you're saying, but an electric rate isn't going to fix this.
No,
We've got a
it'll
community
help.
problem.
It'll help.
Well, I think when you allow Billy to finish, you're gonna find out we already have one of the most affordable rates there is. I don't think we can get it any cheaper. So, go ahead and finish. I didn't-
Okay, well, this was, everything I've shown you so far in this story was about residential stuff, but as I finished up my data discovery mission that the board sent me out on, we, in early 2015, were able to look at all 4 of the rates that we had in existence at the time. Residential, everybody understands. GSA 1 is small commercial, you know, that's like lawyer offices and accounting offices, you know, just small little businesses. GSA 2 is smaller, larger than GSA 1. Those would be fast food restaurants, you know, medium-sized retail type operations, that kind of thing. Schools often in there. GSA 3 is industrial customers. Those are the ones we measure as being greater than 1,000 kW, and there's only like 13 of those in Glasgow. It used to be a lot more, but in those days, and today, there's 13. And so we measured the over and under collection for each rate class, and it produced this pretty shocking graphic. We were under collecting for the residential class by about $1.3 million a year. How can you afford to do that? We were under collecting from the small commercial by about $250,000 a year. And the way we got it was we went next door to the medium commercial and the large commercial and borrowed from them to provide this benefit over here. I presented this to the board and I said, this is the situation. What do you think we should do about it? We got legal advice too, saying, you know what, when these guys find out, they might not be happy about that. And we, now that I've presented this information to the board, it's discoverable. Now, you can't hide this anymore. So the instructions were, develop a rate to try to get everybody at 0. And we went out on that mission.
Could not the industry write it off as a cost of doing business? And we can't. Residential can't.
Yeah, but still dollars, Mark.
I know.
I mean,
But they
if
can-
you get a
they can
tax
hang it off
deduction for
their
something at today's tax rate, 21% is in a corporation, you're still spending 79% of that dollar.
Come on, guys,
Right.
this is way out of order.
Well, I mean, I would just say that this is within the capacity of the board to change this. I'm telling the story of what happened in the past. You know, they looked at this and said, seems to me that you should develop a rate that gets everybody close to 0. That you break even, nobody's served at a loss, nobody's over collected from. And the ones that we were over collected from, this is just a quick example of what a large commercial, a large industrial customer looks like. Same numbers, they're a little more complicated because they have a maximum demand and a coincident peak demand. But the average large commercial customer was paying an extra $4,600 a month, more than the supportable cost for serving them. We didn't know that, we didn't do that on purpose, but until we got this data, we didn't know about it. So, here's the next landing point. That I can tell you that here's how those past boards felt. They felt like once you discover cross-subsidy and understand it, it shouldn't go forward without correcting it. They said that since you've got the data available, being piled up in a file server back there, you should not ignore it. You should go into it and dig it up and find out what it's telling you. And then finally, they felt that true cost-based rates should be the EPB goal. Now, I don't know if we're gonna all agree on that, but that's the next landing area that would act as the foundation for me going forward, if you want me to keep going. Okay, well, I'll forge ahead. So they said, do something about it. And so here's what we did. We threw away the principles that led us to a volumetric rate that provided so much unfairness or perceived unfairness. And we just replaced it with a very simplistic rate that is just like this, except that it measures everything so that each individual customer pays what they personally cost instead of what the group cost divided by the number of customers. And that became our variable non-volumetric or infotricity rate. And in early 2016, it went into place. Now let me talk just 1 second about this, the concept of coincident peak demand. Because the word coincident is important. You saw on the bill where TVA charges us for the peak demand for the month. It doesn't say coincident. Well, coincident is our word that we created to describe the fact that every peak is made up in Glasgow of 8,000 individual customers doing their part to create the peak. And so what each customer does coincident with the peak hour is what we call the coincident peak demand. It's not my favorite phrase, but it's pretty descriptive of what it means, although I think there's still fairly wide misunderstanding of what that means. So that's what it means. And you all know that I put that up there because a big part of the variable rate is the coincident peak demand. Now, Mark or someone asked this earlier, and I'm glad I've got this put together. For 2018, because there's often a question, well, why should we pay for the peak? Somebody else causes it. Well, actually, in 2018, you took 12 peaks, averaged them together, and synthesized what each rate class contributed to the average peak, and you found out that the biggest contributor was actually GSA 2, medium commercial customers. Who's number 2? Residential, 29%. Number 3 turns out to be GSA 3, the large commercial. The biggest ones, because we got so few of them now, only contributes 21% to the average peak in 2018. And then finally, small commercial, 15%. I mean, that's a lot smaller. It's half of the size of residential, but they're all significant. And that's the beauty of a coincident peak. Doesn't matter what anybody else does. What did you do? What did you do to create your part of that peak demand? And you can see it's pretty evenly spread out, or it was in 2018. In days past, you know, when Glasgow was much more robust with respect to industrial customers, this 21% here would probably have been more like 40%. But today, this is what the world looks like. So what happened in 16 and 17? Well, it's a lot of discussion. And in late 2016, the board directed me to create an alternative rate for residential and small commercial that looked like the old rate architecture, just with a kilowatt hour charge and a customer charge. We did that. We went, only thing different was that we went back and used the real numbers that we had discovered in our research and used that to produce a more accurate flat rate. But we did that. So, you know, there was a great hue and cry. We responded and created that rate in 2016. In 2017, there was still a considerable hue and cry. And TVA stepped in and said, we think that you should create an advisory council and we'll help pay for it. We'll get a third-party consultant. You guys stay away from it. Let's let this group of Glasgow citizens and this consultant get together and meet. We agreed to support that. They did it, they met, they came together and produced recommendations that they thought we should implement, and we did. This board, the board in 2017, listened to those recommendations and we implemented them. We did that. Each thing we've been asked to do, we've done. So that brings us kind of up to today. And this is about the end of this. So we got 4 years now worth of data on residential. RS is residential. And you can see this is how much we were losing on the average customer in 2015. In 2016, we put everybody on the infotricity rate. It did what the board wanted, nearly zero. The only reason it wasn't zero is the TVA still, you'll notice on the residential bill that it's like a $26 or $27 customer charge instead of $41, which is what it ultimately needs to be when we reduce our kilowatt hour charges to flat wholesale costs with no markup. But it was very close to being perfect. As we started going backwards again, these are when we offered the alternative rates. And so we began to go back, and that's where we are today, to this problematic rate. And then this is just the bookends. Residential on one side and the very biggest customers on the right side, GSA 3s. They were overpaying by $4,700 a month. In 2016, under the new rate, they came down to only overpaying $1,100 a month. Then it was down a little bit more. Now, it's creeping back up a little bit because of this. We still are not achieving the orbit closely around the zero axis because we've still got this problem. So there's still a little bit of subsidy going on. It's a lot better than it used to be, but the decisions that we made and the board agreed to concede have hampered our progress toward a truly cost-based retail rate for energy. One other thing that we noticed in 2014, we thought this was going to be a trend, and guess what? It was a trend and continues to be a trend. So now we've got an additional 4 years of data, and the trend that we predicted turned out to be a real trend, and our fixed costs still orbit around $4.2 million a year. Finally, the impact on Glasgow's economy gets precious little attention. But this is a representation of January of this year. The blue lines are days when we predicted a peak, and we used all 4 in January. In fact, we used all 4, and then another day came that we would have liked to have had a peak prediction in our toolbox. We didn't have it. So if we had had it, and if we had not agreed to stop at 4 days, the distance between where this day would have been and where these days were for peak in January under the old rate structure, that's about $70,000. But instead, we only got that distance, which is only about $30,000. But still, we're averaging $30,000, $40,000 a month that the reshaped load so that it takes fewer rectangles to cover this load. In Glasgow, we're reshaping the load, and that $40,000 a month in a year turns into $500,000, and that money stays in Glasgow's economy instead of going to TVA. That is what most people would consider a victory, not a defeat. So that's where we are. I propose that the EPB has listened. This story tells the story that we've listened, implemented recommendations of the public. We've altered the rate that we first designed to approach perfection in ways that were responsive to the public. We still think the cost-based rates are better than estimated cost retail rates. Or up until today. I mean, it's your all's job to decide if you agree with this now. But the revenues necessary to pay fixed costs are best collected by a fixed charge. It's the only way you get accuracy. Any volumetric rate produces this wide disparity that I've demonstrated with the red and green dots, where almost no one is actually paying the true cost of service. Variable rates reshape the load and minimize Glasgow money flowing to TVA, and that we should continue on that path until we're 100% non-volumetric. That's the presentation.
Okay, go back to just the last slide. So something I think is important, I hear all the time that there's savings, but it's savings, industry savings on the back of residential. And it's actually the reshaping of the load that's brought about the efficiency. The savings is through efficiency. The savings is not at the expense of one over the other. And I think that's really important. I've heard that over and over, but that's not. Do you have the slide that shows our effective power cost?
I've shown you every slide I've got in here.
Well, the last year, the most recent data we have,
Yeah.
Glasgow EPB was the fourth effective lowest power cost from TVA of 154 distributors.
Is that a load factor you're talking about?
Load factor.
Well, no, it's effective power cost, meaning your ratio of load factor versus kilowatt hours. We buy more kilowatt hours per KW than 150 other distributors. That's efficiency, which is directly, ultimately, our actual power
Which
cost.
determines our price.
Sure, so, but my point is, that's efficiency, that's savings through efficiency.
So a low load factor is not necessarily good for residential though.
No,
A high
it's-
load factor is what you want.
Everybody wants a high load
Everybody
factor.
wants high load factor.
We've got the lowest load factor.
No,
No,
Well, which is it?
It's the highest, fourth highest.
lowest
Well, everybody
effective
says
cost
we got the
power.
fourth
The
lowest
highest,
load
the
factor.
highest,
That's
No,
not
listen,
good.
listen to what he's
the
saying.
highest,
Listen to what he's saying. He's saying two different things.
we're the
The
fourth,
highest load factor translates to
Effectiveness.
the lowest effective cost of power.
Right.
Okay? The highest load factor relates to the lowest effective cost of power.
efficiency
Okay, so
and
he's
power
saying-
cost are inverse.
Right.
The higher your load factor, the fewer of those rectangles it takes to
Right.
cover.
So the things, when I was on the board in, say, 15, several things that really struck, but the first thing, you can have two houses, side by side. They can have the exact same retail power bill, be it $100 or $150 or $75, but two vastly different financial implications on the EPB. And over time, the actions of one customer group actually can affect another group's power cost more than it would their own. And that meaning a group that is highly coincident, but if we're collecting through volumetrically, you make that up on your high users. And that's our industries. And that's not, we don't want to penalize our job providers, not in this community.
Now, the one thing, big takeaway that I think most people, I don't know, need to understand in this, and whether they do or not, I have no idea, but we are selling power for the same price that we're paying for it. We are at wholesale.
Well,
Well, when we get to 100% non-volumetric,
Okay.
today,
The goal is,
it's actually about a 2/3, I think, if you.
but we're close, right? I mean, that's the goal.
Closer than we were.
Is to
we
sell
were
it.
really close in 2016, we're falling away from that.
All right, we just pass it through. And then we cover all of the cost of operating all of this grid, the substations, the people, the equipment, your linemen that are out there working day and night, keeping the grid reliable. All of that is paid for with that customer charge. Everything else is a pass-through rate, wholesale rates. All right, that is not determined by us, it's determined by TVA. And it's solely based on the time and the amount of power that's being delivered to us is determining what that wholesale rate is.
TVA sets the rate that we can charge?
TVA sets their rate, we pass their rate through to our customers.
The kilowatt.
Yeah, it's a
I think also
pass-through
have to
wholesale
approve
rate.
our
Yeah.
retail
Right.
rate.
Yeah.
They're our
But you
regulator.
can say we can charge 12 cents a kilowatt, and they,
We could ask them,
that's what I'm saying.
No, they're your regulator too.
Yeah,
Mark's
now
saying
listen, Mark said something last board meeting, and I didn't get a chance to address it then, but he asked, there is no oversight, or he said, there is no oversight, there's no regulating authority here. But we have the Tennessee Valley Authority as our regulating authority that is made up of board members that are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Congress of the United States. It is a federal entity that oversees our operations and that is our oversight authority within our operations. That is a much greater oversight authority than public service commissions, which are which are set up by each state and then regulate investor-owned utilities and other utilities that are based within each state independently. We are regulated by a federal authority that has oversight by the United States Congress. Okay?
Federal's not, they get paid a lot of money, and those guys get paid a lot of money.
What does that
Board
mean?
members. When you go to their meetings, they will not let you talk but for 3 minutes.
Okay, but what does that mean?
Well, it means that they aren't as effective as doing other things.
Mark,
We're way beyond the report.
Mark, I've been involved in
Let's call
federal
a
audit
halt to
guidelines,
this.
federal audit guidelines.
Let's
You know,
call a halt
I
to this.
understand
This is
that
getting
there
way
are
out of order.
much greater oversight when it comes to federal authority than there is with state
We
authority.
have business to transact. Let's get on with it. You're out of order. Let's move.
DT, I have